All right, well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining our DataBytes session today. We're going to be exploring student success outcomes for Rio's student body. And so a lot of this is in prep for Spring Planning Day coming up at the end of March, thinking about how our student outcomes really inform a lot of the work that we're doing strategically at the college. A lot of the initiatives that we participate in, a lot of the technology enhancements that we're gearing up for are all directly related to supporting our students and making sure they're as successful as possible. So this really serves as a level set and understanding how our students are currently faring in their different programs of study here at the college, and just trying to socialize some of the outcomes and some of the drivers that might be leading to what we're seeing. So a bit of a rundown for today. I do have a little bit of just high level enrollment and awards data to share, keeping everybody up to speed on how our enrollment is trending, how our awards generation is trending, looking at a couple of different peer comparison frameworks that we participate in and or are included in, and then some of our internally developed modeling around student outcomes, knowing that we've got very nuanced and unique student population here at the college and a lot of need to really better understand outside of more traditional reporting methodology how our students enter into the college and progress as they experience the Rio programs. So I apologize. I played around with the slide deck and apparently have misplaced my enrollment trends. Give me just a second to stop presenting and grab another version of this slide. This is the trouble with trying to be fancy leading up to presenting. Mm, there we go. Okay, similar slide deck, slightly different scope. Okay, so while enrollment isn't an important metric in terms of thinking about our student outcomes, it does certainly have a lot of weight carried these days, especially within the new governing board approved budget model that the system now operates within. And so even though it's not an output, it's certainly an input. It's important to understand what our enrollment looks like, both because it frames up kind of our sustainability as an institution, but then it also informs what our kind of denominator is as we start to think through calculating things like retention rates and graduation rates. We have to know how many students we're serving, how many fall into different buckets and categories that we're wanting to track and evaluate in terms of their performance, and hopefully then keep them retained and enrolled and continuing on through graduation. So quick hit here just to kind of understand our student enrollment trend. What you're seeing here on the slide is about 10 years worth of enrollment data for the college. I'd like to just point out here that our numbers are inclusive of both our for credit, kind of standard data, if you will, students who are enrolled in our degree and certificate programs, as well as other supplemental students who might be enrolled in programs like dual enrollment. They might be here just to earn a few credits to transfer back to another institution. But in addition to that, we're also including our non-credit adult education population. So our HSE students, our ELA students who are served within the community development division, they're also included here. It's an important distinction because you'll not see that reflected in Maricopa system-wide dashboards that are produced at the district office. They don't have visibility into our adult ed data. And so oftentimes the numbers might conflict because they're not also honoring that activity that's occurring here at our local campus. So we include that, although they're not budgeted into the district's budget model. So a lot of nuance to kind of juggle, but important to make sure that we're reinforcing that those students are truly also served by the college and hopefully advocating for different channels to bring them into consideration when budget comes to time as well. But as you can see here, we're still kind of clawing back a little bit of the enrollment that we've lost over the last decade. Rio is not unique in this position. Many institutions nationally, especially in the 2-year college space, really lost a lot of enrollment from about 2010 through the beginning of the COVID pandemic. There was a lot of enrollment acceleration that was caused by the Great Recession that happened in the early 2000s. And that drove a lot of students back into education, looking to re-career and find alternative pathways for themselves to kind of navigate the economic circumstances of the day. As the recovery unfolded, fewer and fewer students were enrolling. That paired with demographic shifts and an aging population really led to this kind of national decline in community college enrollment. So that was expressed both here at Rio and nationally as well. However, following the pandemic, we've started to see a resurgence in that. There's a lot of renewed interest in community colleges, ironically, especially under today's kind of political environment. There's a lot of big calls for engaging in CTE programs and trades programs, many of which are offered at community colleges. So you're seeing a lot of enrollment starting to trend up in that space as well. Our recovery efforts have been pretty strong coming out of COVID, and even more so than we're seeing system-wide around the district. As you can see on the slide here, from the beginning of the pandemic until now, we've seen about a 23-point jump in our enrollment numbers. A lot of that has been fueled by growth in specific programs like Guild. And as we're seeing more and more students come into the college through those types of channels and through other ways, many of our numbers are beginning to recover. Importantly, however, we've not yet fully recovered from our pre-COVID numbers. And that's an important distinction because a lot of the governing board budget model that was adapted was based on this kind of concept of enrollment recovery. So a lot of the weight that is given to different institutions within our system as it pertains to budget numbers is all around this concept of how well have we recovered since COVID. And so as we continue to trend in that direction and we get to those points, we'll be better positioned to advocate for some change and making sure that we're adequately funded within the new budget model. Another important thing for us to consider outside of things like graduation rates and retention rates is also just celebrating the annual award generation that we continue to have success with here at the college. I don't have this stat on this particular slide, but it's something that I used to report out to in the new employee orientation sessions, that almost 1 out of 4 degrees or certificates that are awarded within the system comes from a Rio Salado College student. So it's a huge point of pride for us. We have very successful programs because we have so much breadth and scope that we offer to our students, and so much success, especially within a lot of our partnership programs that are offered within the ESP model. So here you can see another kind of trended data set showing our awards track over the last 5 or 6 years. We're certainly seeing a lot of stability, but I don't know that I would characterize this as growth, as we saw in kind of our enrollment recovery efforts on that last slide. However, we do know that there's a lot of change and adaptation coming, especially with beginning to offer things like bachelor's degrees and a lot of strong interest in those programs of study. So we're anticipating this to continue to increase, especially as we continue to really reinvest in a lot of those targeted partnership opportunities that are offered within our ESP model. Again, here I like to include the high school equivalency diplomas. This is a stat that I get directly from the community development team. While it's not reflected in SIS, I just like to celebrate the fact that last year we awarded 316 high school equivalency diplomas. That was a record number for the community development team. And again, just a point of pride for the breadth and scope of what this institution has to offer. So a little bit of framing here. Why is this all important? So obviously we want to do our best to serve our student population. We want as many of them who come here with an intent to graduate from Rio Salado College to be able to achieve that goal. We know that 75%, give or take, of our students don't start here with that notion in mind. However, we do serve thousands of students annually who state that they want to earn a degree or certificate with the college. And as such, we're held accountable to those things. And there's a couple new accountability measures that are really in place now to shore that up and even further, call us to account if and when we're not meeting the thresholds that external entities think that we should be. And so one of those is in HLC. HLC last year rolled out a brand new student success indicator framework wherein they're evaluating institutional performance on key measures of student success, things like graduation rates and retention rates, against the peers that you are kind of compared against that are accredited within the HLC network. So annually now, HLC is going to be scrubbing our IPEDS data, looking at our institutional performance across these three key measures, stacking us up against other two-year institutions who are accredited within the HLC network, and then making some value judgments about are we performing well or not well compared to our peers. And if not, then their expectation would be that we have some information available to explain why that might be the case and what we might be doing to help to support kind of a turnaround. So a couple key things to keep in mind here. This is all information that's coming from IPEDS. If you've ever heard me talk about IPEDS, you've probably heard me say that it's not a great framework for community colleges, and that's especially so for Rio. IPEDS traditionally looks at things like first time to college students, students who are enrolled full-time in their programs of study, and students who enroll prior to the census date, what we call 45th day here, within your fall semester cohort. None of those things are very strong markers of Rio student population. About 85% of our students are enrolled part-time, 60% of them enter into the institution with some prior higher education experience, and many of them just don't have the financial means, the time commitment means to be able to dedicate enough of their life into pursuit of their, and so we're not really able to fully understand their outcomes within some of the time frames that frameworks like IPEDS are evaluating them against. So for instance, one of the metrics that they're looking at is what they call the 150% graduation rate, which measures the percentage of your entering student cohort who graduates within 150% of normal time to completion. So for a 2-year associate's degree, that 150% measure is against 3 years. They're looking only at first-time full-time students, and they want to know students who are entering into your institution prior to 45th day, which with our rolling start dates doesn't really reflect our total student body. This metric annually captures less than 1% of our students. And so because this is given so much importance and weight in HLC and other reporting kind of peer benchmarking frameworks, it's a little problematic for us. And so we'll talk through a little bit of that later. Retention rate is another metric that they're looking at. So they want to understand for students who are entering in a fall term, how many of them either return in that next subsequent fall and or graduate in that 1-year time frame. Within retention rate, you are allowed to also include part-time students. So the number grows a little bit, hence the variability and the cohort counts that you're kind of seeing described there. And then the third outcome that they're looking at is arguably the best, if you will, for us. It's what they call a completion and transfer outcome. It's something that's reported on a much longer time series. In here, they're allowing us to measure student outcomes against 8 years of enrollment activity with the college. So we get to include any full-time and part-time student, anyone who enters in without the entire calendar year evaluated against a fiscal year, kind of July 1 to June 30 timeframe. And then we get to say after 8 years, how many of those students have either completed with us and or transferred to another institution. So especially for those students who we know are coming to us with grander aspirations of moving on beyond Rio Salado, we're able to evaluate them and count their success as our success. So how is HLC going to do this? So they grab all the IPEDS data from other institutions who are accredited within their network, and then they calculate these kind of measures of central tendency to understand how our peers performing. This is based on last year's data, and this year's data we're anticipating will be delivered probably this week or next week. And so we can see here that last year against our peers, on average, there was about a 55% retention rate, a 34% graduation rate, and a 59% give or take grad transfer rate. There were 321 peers who are 2-year urban institutions who are accredited within HLC, and so that's the group that we're being compared against. And here's how our data shook out. So I mentioned on a couple slides ago that they take your last 3 years worth of reported IPEDS data, and then they kind of average those together to give you a composite score that you're using to evaluate against peer performance. So last year, if you take all 3 of those past years into consideration, we had about a 7% graduation rate. I mentioned that's our first time full-time population. Not very flattering of our college, but a lot of reasons why that's the case. Retention rate was at about 34%, which was closer to what we saw, but not quite what we saw among our peers, but not quite where we want to be. And then our completion transfer rate was 60%, which we see it was above what the peer average was. And so these numbers are what's taken into consideration and then evaluated to understand how well an institution is performing relative to its peers. Give me just a second because I'm now remembering that I had to switch slide decks when I had not included our enrollment trends, and I just want to like make sure that I've got the right stats for y'all as we're moving into this next section of the agenda. All right, quick little transition here. Thanks for bearing with me. And so then we were about here. So what happens if you kind of find yourself on the naughty list, so to speak? So if you're an institution where your completion and transfer rate is within the lowest fifth percentile of all peer institutions, you're going to get dinged by HLC and asked to account for what's going on. If you're an institution where your completion transfer rate is between the 5th and 25th percentiles, again, you're going to get dinged and asked to kind of go on to not a full monitoring report, but some sort of improvement plan with HLC where you can demonstrate over time that you are making substantive change to be able to improve. What happened to us last year is that we got dinged in this area. We didn't meet either of these two conditions because our performance in that completion transfer outcome is so strong, but we did get dinged because our graduation rate was in the lowest 5%. So Carol and I, along with many others around the college, put together a nice little report, conveyed that back to HLC, let them know that, we recognize that this is an area of opportunity for the college. We have dedicated strategies and initiatives in place in order to turn this trend around. They took our word for it and, they set us off on their way. We're anticipating this is going to happen again this year. Unfortunately, for a variety of reasons, our 150% grad rate is going to be a tough nut to crack. So few of our students fall into that category. And while I would never want to use President Smith's words, explain the data away and make excuses for why that's not happening, it's going to be challenging for us to get that cohort into an area of performance where we're exceeding peer benchmarks. And so that's something that we're going to have to continue to work on, frankly, as a college. But nevertheless, a lot of great work happening that we'll share about here in just a little bit that really is hoping to turn the tides on some of what we've been seeing over the last several years and getting us back into the right position. Another framework that you'll probably increasingly hear more about, which is why I wanted to include it, is the Aspen Unlocking Opportunities benchmarking framework. A few of our sister institutions within Maricopa are participating in this new Aspen benchmarking group. And so increasingly, you're probably going to hear murmurings of it in different cross-functional teams that you might participate in. Aspen measures performance in a similar way to HLC. The benefit for us here is that there's no accountability that comes with this, but it's more of a recognition. Aspen is an entity which recognizes exemplars in the higher education space, and they go so far as to then financially incentivize institutions who are strong performers to continue their work. And so it's something that, if possible, we'd love to be included in so that we can compete for those types of grant opportunities. This is data that was prepared from Australia Mountain Community College using the Aspen benchmarking framework methodology, where you can see our peer institutions within Maricopa benchmarked against us on this kind of 3-year graduation and transfer rate outcome. So our performance here isn't as strong, although it's much stronger than the 150% grad rate numbers that we were seeing on a couple slides ago. And it allows us to start to have serious conversations around a lot of the new outcomes measures that are coming into the fold. If you've been paying attention at all to any of the developments in the federal government around higher education, you'll likely have understood that there's a lot of emphasis now on post-graduation outcomes, i.e. employment and earnings data. And so what Aspen unlocks for us, hence the Unlocking Opportunities moniker, is the ability to better understand and confront those types of challenges and really position ourselves in a space where we're able to fully support students from the point of entry, not through just to graduation, but to completion, entry into the labor market, earning of a high quality wage, et cetera, et cetera. John and I just spent a good deal of time chatting about this the other day, and I know he's got a lot of great ideas about supporting the college's efforts in this way. So I appreciate you being here today, John, just to help kind of lend some voice to that if there's any questions that come about. For our purposes, and just to kind of arm President Smith with some information, we had anticipated this ASPA data was going to start to get circulated. So I pulled this together, which looks at our 8-year outcomes that we talked about a couple slides ago here on this completion and transfer number. So when you compare Rio Salado numbers against on our 8-year timeline for completion and transfer against all the other peers in our network, we actually are outperforming our peers. And so it just goes to show that we know this is to be true of our students. Our students enter in coming from all walks of life. They, on average, can only enroll in 1 or 2 classes per semester. They've got childcare, family care responsibilities. They're working adults on average, right? I'm making generalizations. But because of that, judging their performance against a 3-year timeline is always going to be tricky for Rio. You know, that's the nature of the beast with our institution. We are accessibility first and foremost. And so with that comes students who, you know, we're have the most potential to really uplift their standing and help them along their way. But at the same time, they're not going to perform against these really stringent timelines that we're seeing in some of these external reporting methodologies. So nice segue. That's why we do a lot to model and estimate student performance against our own kind of internally developed methodology, not to make excuses for our data and not to make kind of special cases on behalf of our students and our institutional performance, but to better and fully understand how our students are performing. If we only relied on the metrics that come from some of those external third-party frameworks, we would never fully understand how our students are performing and being able to critically examine where there might be strength and opportunity for us to consider. So these next series of slides allow us to kind of investigate that element of it and understand from our own internal reporting how our students are performing. So this first slide that we're going to look at is persistence. And so persistence is a key measure that helps us to understand how well students are navigating from their first semester of enrollment with the college into their second semester of enrollment. Now, this will be true for the next few slides, and so I'll just go ahead and state this case here. The methodology for this is that we're including anybody who enters into the college and declares a degree or certificate. It doesn't matter if they enter in fall, spring, or summer. We are capturing them into the cohort. We do have the ability to disaggregate if we wanted to exclude, you know, something like spring semester starters. But we want to also then honor, you know, the nature of the Rio student population, being able to count them and evaluate their performance. And so here we're looking at, again, students who are enrolled in term 1, what percentage of all of those students who entered into the college declared a degree or certificate in that first semester of enrollment, what percentage of them then moved on into semester 2? And so here I'm presenting about a 10-year trend, about 11 years here, but 10-year trend on looking at student performance across this metric. As you can see, we've had about a 5.3 percentage point bump over the last 10 years that we're looking at in this data set. On average, over the last 3 years, we've seen about a 46.5% persistence rate among our students in transitioning from semester 1 to semester 2. And it's marked by a pretty pronounced uptick following the COVID-19 pandemic. Keen observers amongst you will probably note that we have been on a bit of a downward trend over the last few years. And so there's a lot of discovery that we're still trying to understand around this. You know, if you think about the timing of this particular cohort that's labeled here as 22, so that's academic year 21, 22 students who entered in fall 21 through the following summer. There were fewer students enrolling at that time. You know, if you think back to that first graph that I showed you with our enrollment trend, that's the point in time where we hit kind of our bottom. So not only did we have fewer students, that was also the launch of guided pathways. And we know a lot of like really rigorous supports were in place, both financially from grants that were coming from the federal government related to the COVID, as well as systematically within Maricopa and really ensuring the students were getting that kind of strong foundational start in guided pathways. And for those reasons, we're speculating that there's maybe an artificial inflation of that number just because there was so much activity happening that was reinforcing student outcomes that might not be sustainable and practical in the long term. So even though we'd like to see our numbers get back to there, and we're starting to get back into that place, I would just encourage us to maybe consider that you're an outlier in thinking through, the larger trend outside of that. As we start to dig into that, we are looking at some of the breakdowns and understanding, well, who's performing maybe stronger, who's performing a little weaker. Is there anything that we can do to understand the dynamics within those aggregate numbers so that we can more critically examine what might be going on and try and engineer some support structures to make sure that we're able to support our students through their journey. So what we're seeing here is that students who start in the more traditional timeframes, fall semester prior to 45th day tend to be the stronger performers. That's pretty intuitive, but it's also good to see those numbers kind of play out in real time so that we can track that and make sure that we're understanding that dynamic. Similarly, we're seeing that students who tend to start in spring more likely are the students who are going to have a tougher time making that transitional jump from term one to term two. I think psychologically, there's probably a lot of generalizations you can make about that and thinking about why would a student choose to start in spring compared to fall, et cetera, et cetera. But again, something that we want to be able to model out for ourselves so that we can track these numbers. In addition to that, we're also keenly aware of and monitoring a lot of the development that's happened, especially in the wake of not gainful employment, guided pathways, and thinking about new structures that are in place to support students, especially in the earliest phases of their enrollment life cycle. And so one of those features that's now in play here in Maricopa is mandatory first year experience coursework for students declared in degree programs. And so, as you would expect, and as we're hoping to see, students who participate in those things like new student orientation and first year experience classes tend to perform stronger than their peers who don't take advantage of those resources. Again, we're only looking here at credential seeking students. And so it's not that, the supplemental student numbers are kind of muddying the waters here. This is truly looking at students who are intending to graduate from a program with us. And what we're seeing is by and large, students who take advantage of at least one of those opportunities tend to have stronger performance and navigate that first important transition point more strongly than a lot of their peers within the college. Retention is another metric that's often floated out there as being something to consider. You saw it reflected in both the HLC framework that we talked about as well as the Aspen framework. And retention here is defined as the percentage of students who are returning a year after their point of entry. As I've mentioned a couple times now, we're considering here both fall starters and spring starters. And so for those reasons, we're tracking retention both across a fall to fall kind of continuum as well as a spring to spring continuum. And here we see a similar yet less pronounced outcome as compared to the persistence numbers that we looked at a couple slides ago. And so while we are seeing some small increases in first to second year retention over time, this continues to be an opportunity for the college. Unfortunately, we are losing about 2/3 of our degree seeking student population prior to their entry into their second year of enrollment. And so this is certainly something that we want to consider as an opportunity for us as we continue to explore ways that we might strengthen that first year experience, expanding it beyond just an FYE type of a component, a class that they take in their first semester and thinking through how are we more intentionally structuring supports along that continuum of year one so that we can more effectively get this number in the right direction that we'd like to see it. When we break some additional things down here, like we just did in that prior breakdown, we see some similar patterns that are coming to light where, students who tend to start in the fall semester tend to be the more successful students. We see a lot of volatility in our spring start cohorts, and we're trying to better understand what might be going on there. But we are also, with that volatility, seeing a little bit more of a pronounced increase in their outcomes. And so something to consider as we continue to adapt the ways in which we provide services to the learners that we support. This is an interesting slide that isn't rocket science, but just something that we were looking at and thought was interesting and noteworthy to take into account. So one of the ways that we try and model whether or not a student is likely to be retained, and is something that Fermin, who I saw jumped on the call in my office, does a lot in the background in supporting some data science around trying to estimate student likelihood of persistence and retention. One of the features that we see is most important is cumulative GPA. And so here, as we're looking at something like a first semester GPA as a predictor of the likelihood to be retained, we're seeing, as you might expect, that students who have stronger GPAs in their first semester are more likely to then re-enroll. So, it continues to pile on evidence around how we can support students who might fall into these different clusters where performance isn't where we would like to see it, and figure out how we can support students, especially who are in those, at risk, to use that language, categories, and thinking about interventions that could be put into place to really help them navigate, even if they don't get the start that they want in their degree or certificate program. The final metric that we're looking at here is completion rate. And just to make this kind of somewhat apples to apples, we're looking at completion rate against a 3-year timeline. This approximates the 150% graduation rate metric for associate's degrees that's used in frameworks like IPEDS, and allows us to understand 3 years post-entry how well are students graduating from the college. What we're seeing here is that cohorts that began following COVID are showing a very clear and distinct kind of bump in their completion rates. The recovery here is a little atypical compared to what we've seen in the retention and persistence numbers that we looked at previously, where you see those older cohorts, 2014, 15, and 16, demonstrated a lot higher performance in this particular metric. As we examine those numbers, what we had found is that back in those timeframes, we were seeing that our ESP student population was getting added into their programs of study and formally declared in degree and certificate programs earlier on in their enrollment life cycle. And so we were able to then kind of capture them as completers in those metrics, whereas more recently, a lot of that program declaration activity doesn't happen until later in the life cycle when they're ready to graduate. And so it goes to show and demonstrate that some of our internal processes sometimes get in our way, where that might be an easier way to kind of onboard and kind of get that batch of students into the system. It doesn't always do us a service in how we're evaluating student performance. And so that's more of like a technicality, but it's certainly something that we can take advantage of. And we've been having some pretty critical conversations with Heather Tyler, the dean who oversees that, as well as Tabitha, the director of ESP, to think about, are there ways that we can more intentionally get our students into their programs of study so that we can kind of take credit for their performance. We know that those programs are very wildly successful, and so we want to be able to, get those numbers reflected in things like IPES and Aspen so that we can continue to strengthen our outcomes in those types of frameworks as well. I won't go into too much detail on these breakdowns because I don't know that there's a lot of, a smoking gun here, so to speak. But one of the features of guided pathways that was really touted in terms of being a predictor of student performance was early GPAs, like we talked about a couple slides ago, dedicated pathways, which is the whole guise of guided pathways, and created that structured sequence of courses where students know what to expect and what to take and when and where and why. Additionally, there's a lot of evidence in the guided pathways literature that really encourages early momentum in things like college level math and English completion. And so here what we're looking at are breakdowns in terms of how well are we getting students to satisfy college level English and math requirements in their first year of study. And so what we're seeing is that, as you might expect, students who consistently complete both gateway courses within their first year of study are more likely to complete, on time than students who don't. Students who don't complete either gateway course typically have a harder time completing. Again, that's not rocket science, right? Many of our degrees and certificates require these types of things in order to complete. So if you can't get them checked off the box, especially early on, and start to gain that momentum, it's going to be tougher for you to overcome some of that momentum. However, we're using these kind of signals to be able to convey some of these points to teams that are in place to support students, like our advisors, so that we can try and encourage students to, you know, engage with this content early on in their life cycle. Being able to build on those skills, which, we know are important in subsequent courses, especially being such a writing intensive institution like Rio, and being able to help students navigate their online coursework as successfully as possible. So, presenting a lot of information, and if you are new to the college, you might be seeing it and thinking, "Wow, that's not exactly what I was hoping we were going to see." For those of us who have been here for a little bit of time, this is unfortunately a story that we've become somewhat used to, but are encouraged by the fact that there's a lot of activity underway to really strengthen student outcomes and try to turn some of these trends around. For years and years and years, and this was true of other schools, not just Rio, but the emphasis was always on enrollment growth. Um, there was a lack of accountability in terms of student outcomes, you know, in the zeitgeist, both in terms of compliance, but also in terms of public opinion. I think that the tide has shifted, and so now we're seeing a lot of renewed focus on things like graduation and soon employment and earnings outcomes as well. And so what are we doing to get in front of this, and how are we going to support our students moving into the future? So we know that there's a ton of teams who are very intentionally tackling these types of things head on through their department and unit level 4DX wigs. I'm thinking about groups like our faculty chairs who have a dedicated strategy around student retention. I'm thinking about teams like our advisors who have a dedicated strategy around getting students into their academic plan, creating a customized learning journey for each and every student so that they know what they need and when they need it. We've got a few of us on the call right now who are engaged in something called HLC Student Success Academy. You've likely seen and or heard some of that in all employee meetings and wave announcements and things, but it's a structured opportunity that's offered through our accreditor HLC, where we can intentionally go through a discovery process, better understanding what are the structures, infrastructure, policies, processes, et cetera, that we have in place to support students. Where might there be gaps? Where might we have opportunities to strengthen some of our approach? And so we're currently starting to formulate a draft student success plan that will be incorporated into the college's new strategic plan. You'll likely hear some about that at the upcoming spring um, planning day meeting. And so this, again, is a nice little primer for that, so that you're armed with some of this information going into that day, and you can help lead some of the conversations on your levels around what's going on in this space at the college. In addition to that, we've got the Education Design Labs Reimagining Community College Initiative that's also been engaged with the college. A lot of emphasis there around career connectedness, which reinforces a lot of the post-graduation outcomes concepts that we've talked about throughout the session this afternoon. EDL has really been leading us along discovery around how are we supporting our students in the classroom? How are we creating stackable opportunities for them to graduate and achieve milestones along the way, even if they have a larger goal? How are we demonstrating to them that they're gaining skills and not just theoretical knowledge? And so a lot of great conversations have been occurring in there. And both HLC, Student Success, and Design Labs have been collaborating more intentionally over the last few months to really reinforce the shared understanding that we're beginning to develop amongst both teams, and really be able to put together a strong proposal to help the college be more successful in these different areas moving forward. And then, of course, Rio wouldn't be Rio without technology, right? We are, kind of the tech community college, and so we're leveraging that technology to improve student support and success here at the college. There's a lot of work being done across the system around Salesforce. Although that might be a bit of a painful transition for some of our teams who use some of the systems that kind of intersect with Salesforce right now, the benefit will be that we'll have everything in one place. We'll be able to understand student communications in a centralized way. We'll be able to understand um, things like caseload management in a centralized way. And so that will really hopefully help strengthen our resolve as we continue to progress on some of these challenges. And then, we know we've heard President Smith talking about Rio Next and the vision for the next generation digital learning environment for the college. And so between those two pieces of technology, as well as other strategies that we're envisioning within our planning efforts, I think the future is bright for the college. We've got a lot of great momentum, a lot of new renewed energy in terms of supporting our students, and a lot of great people here to always help with the work. So lots of great things to come, and we'll hear lots more about it at Spring Planning Day in just another month or so. So with that, opening up the floor for questions, any ideas, reflections, Q&A that anybody wants to engage in. Happy to have a conversation. A lot of great perspectives on the call today, which is great. I appreciate y'all being here. And yeah, anything that we can do. Yeah, John.
I don't know if some of you had a chance to watch that interview the chancellor had with, I think his name is Rich Nickel, but he really talked about access in terms of being much more than enrollment. And I think he's probably right on. I mean, there's so many things go into, you know, enroll, being successful initially, not only enrolling, but making sure you have the resources, the technology set up, the guidance along the way. Anyway, it's related to what you said in terms of some of the initial drop off from when our students enroll, or I mean, that first semester.
Yeah, I mean, those are all really great points, John. And if I, my opinion on the matter, right, is that we've got a high degree of accessibility here at the college, almost so much so that we get ourselves into this position where we have so many students, right? They're enrolling at all points in time, and so a lot of these initiatives that are underway are really grounded in the idea of understanding those dynamics and figuring out how we can support students no matter when and where they might enter into the college. Because more so than others, we've got students just kind of all over the place, and so we've got to figure out how to wrap our heads around that and be able to deliver the quality that they need. All right, well, I'm going to stop recording.